small nation, once dismissed as fragile, stunned the world overnight. Its victory was not measured in goals or trophies, but in the tremor of millions who suddenly remembered what dignity feels like. Under the quiet determination of Ibrahim Traoré, a continent that had long been told to stay silent began to speak again, not through speeches, but through pride that could not be contained. Yet what unfolded after the cheers faded is the part that turned triumph into a warning for the powerful. They told you this was just a football story, a match, a trophy, a smile on a podium. But what you are about to discover goes far beyond sport. It is the anatomy of a message the world tried not to hear. You will understand why Ibrahim Traoré's words that night were not praise but prophecy. And if you stop listening now, you will miss how a single victory exposed the hidden balance of power between Africa and those who claim to celebrate it. Because ignoring this moment is not neutrality, it is blindness. The revelation came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. What seemed like a speech of celebration was, in truth, a coded declaration of independence, one that reached from a football field to the heart of African politics. Just hours after the CAN 2025 final, when Sadio Mané lifted the trophy, Ibrahim Traoré's words began circling online, nearly 12 million views in less than 48 hours, and just as many questions. He spoke not of sport, but of history, of chains, silence, and the cost of dignity. The moment he said the world loves African talent when it does not speak of justice, the tone shifted. It was no longer a congratulation, it was a reckoning. Observers across the Sahel recognized it as the first time a sitting leader had framed victory on the field as a call for mental decolonization. The context matters. Burkina Faso, isolated after the 2022 coup, had rebuilt its identity under siege, sanctions, media boycotts, and regional suspicion. When Traoré stood behind that microphone, he carried not just a message, but a warning that pride without consciousness is a fragile triumph. And those who heard him understood this was not a night of glory, but the start of a storm. The man guiding that storm was already familiar with resistance. Ibrahim Traoré had become the voice of a generation too proud to kneel and too weary to beg. To some, he was a rebel soldier turned president. To others, the living proof that defiance could still sound like integrity. When he spoke of Africa's victories, he did not speak as a politician, but as a guardian of awakening. Those who worked beside him recall a night in Ouagadougou when the electricity cut mid-speech. He kept speaking in the dark, his voice carrying through phones lit by flashlights, the crowd refusing to disperse. It was not theater, it was testament. A people who had chosen to listen beyond comfort. Weeks later, a teacher from Bobo Dioulasso told State Radio how her students repeated his lines instead of memorizing slogans. In Mali and Niger, young officers quoted him as they reshaped their own commands. The echo was no longer national. It had crossed borders. What began as a match had become a movement, and from that night forward, no observer could still call this just another speech. It was the moment when leadership turned into literacy, when pride learned to read itself aloud. It began with a spark that no one planned. When Ibrahim Traoré's speech met the roar of Sadio Mané's victory, the Sahel itself seemed to awaken. First came the applause, then the questions, and then the fear. Governments across the region watched the clips spread faster than any communique they had ever issued. Within hours, journalists in Dakar, Abidjan, and Bamako were replaying his words. When an African wins without permission, he becomes dangerous. Crowds gathered in markets to listen again, not to the match commentary, but to the message. Something had shifted. In those first 48 hours, ministries issued cautious statements, some praising unity, others warning against politicizing sport. By the third day, the story was everywhere. Hashtags, debates, editorials, the contagion of pride. And then came the backlash. Diplomatic channels tightened, sponsors whispered. One television feed was cut mid-broadcast, but the momentum refused to die. Every attempt to mute it made it louder. As the euphoria faded, an unease settled. Perhaps this joy had teeth. By the end of the week, Burkina Faso's streets had turned into classrooms of reflection, poems on walls, chants in markets, children imitating Traoré's cadence. The match was over, but the movement had only just begun. He began the next phase not with passion, but with numbers. In the weeks following the final, Burkina Faso recorded a 17% surge in youth registration for national civic programs, the highest since 2014. That figure, modest on paper, signaled something deeper. Belief had turned measurable. At the same time, regional trade with neighboring Sahel states rose by 9%, reversing 2 years of sanctions-induced contraction. It was not just commerce returning, it was confidence rediscovered. Economists in Ouagadougou noted a quiet pattern. Markets once stagnant were suddenly busy on Mondays, the day after every speech or public statement, and yet the most telling metric came from outside. An international survey showed that 68% of young Africans had heard of Ibrahim Traoré's remarks to Sadio Mané, even more than those who followed the match itself. The message had outlived the event. Numbers, however, are not only mirrors, they are pressure points. As optimism grew, so did scrutiny. Human rights monitors warned of new authoritarian impulses. Opposition groups accused the government of turning symbolism into control. For every gain in pride, there was a cost in perception. Still, the weight of proof was undeniable. Factories reopened. Schools launched new civic curriculums. And in local papers, a phrase appeared again and again. When dignity moves, the economy follows. By grounding his rhetoric in data, Traoré had done what few revolutionaries manage. He made inspiration quantifiable. And in doing so, he reminded the world that belief too can have a growth rate. Even his critics admitted the paradox. Ibrahim Traoré had become both the symbol of rebellion and the subject of suspicion. Supporters called him the conscience of a continent. Skeptics called him a populist in camouflage. And both in their own way were right. The first argument was simple. Pride can't replace policy. Economists warned that national dignity, however inspiring, doesn't build roads or balance budgets. To them, Traoré's words were poetry against arithmetic. But he countered quietly, pointing to the data, the civic rise, the cross-border trade, the new teachers hired since the Coup final. For him, numbers and narrative were not enemies. They were tools of the same awakening. The second argument cut deeper. Human rights advocates feared the rhetoric of unity could blur dissent. They asked, when a leader speaks of collective pride, who defines the collective? Yet even in criticism, they admitted the honesty of his warning, that silence had once cost Africa its voice. So the debate widened. Universities hosted forums titled Patriotism or Populism. Writers in Dakar and Niamey published essays asking whether justice and sovereignty can coexist in a world built on dependency. And through it all, Traoré remained a paradox, defiant yet disciplined, radical yet procedural. By facing his strongest opponents fairly, he did something rare. He proved that conviction and contradiction can share the same heartbeat. In a century allergic to nuance, that alone was revolutionary. And then came the turn no one expected. One morning, without ceremony, Ibrahim Traoré ordered the release of the full transcript of his speech, uncensored, untranslated, unedited. It was his way of saying nothing to hide. The decision changed everything. Readers discovered lines omitted from headlines, moments where his tone softened instead of flared. The message that had sounded like defiance now read like duty. And with that revelation, perception cracked open. Diplomats, who had dismissed him as incendiary, began quoting his exact words. Cultural figures turned fragments of his address into verses, theater, music. In Lagos, a youth collective staged the speech that spoke back, using his text as both mirror and manifesto. For a continent used to slogans, it felt like a sudden instruction manual for dignity. What this midpoint exposed was not merely a leader's courage, but the system's discomfort. He had taken what was meant to be a moment of spectacle and turned it into an archive of accountability. Every word could now be traced. every omission judged. From here, the story was no longer about one man's speech. It was about what happens when truth is allowed to circulate without permission. When the echo settled, consequences began to take shape. Governments adjusted their tones, institutions their silence. And for the first time, people measured the ripple of a sentence in economic, social, and political terms. For the state, the effects were immediate. Cabinets in several Sahel nations revised their public communication, replacing press releases with citizen dialogues. Even foreign embassies shifted language from aid to partnership, cautious but telling. One official admitted privately, "Traore forced us to speak to Africa as adults, not as subjects." For business, the tremor was practical. In Burkina Faso, local manufacturers reported a 14% rise in domestic investment within 2 months. Modest but historic. Regional entrepreneurs began co-branding products under a new slogan, "Made with African Pride." It was marketing, yes, but it was also reclamation. For the people, the change ran deeper. Street art in Ouagadougou turned patriotic colors into murals of resilience. Teachers used the Cannes 2025 final as a lesson in self-worth. Parents named their newborn Sadio, Ibrahim, or simply Faso. A nation's self-image had become inheritance. And for the region, the message reached capitals far beyond. Observers in Ghana, Benin, and Togo noted a subtle diplomatic realignment. Fewer apologies, more assertion. Africa was no longer asking to be seen. It was deciding how to be watched. By the time the world realized it, the discourse had already shifted permanently. The horizon now divided into 3 paths. The first was the most likely, the base scenario. Under it, Ibrahim Traoré's message would continue to resonate, but gradually stabilize. Burkina Faso would consolidate its civic momentum, while juggling fragile alliances. The pride would remain. Yet the pace of transformation would slow into routine, progress by persistence, not miracle. The optimistic path gleamed brighter. If regional governments embraced shared sovereignty instead of rivalry, the Sahel could turn defiance into cooperation. Joint infrastructure projects, cultural exchanges, even unified trade policies could follow. The best case was not utopia, it was maturity. Africa writing in its own tense instead of being written about. But the worst case loomed like a shadow. If pride hardened into isolation, if rhetoric replaced reform, the very energy that inspired could implode. Aid could shrink, currencies wobble, and public trust erode. A continent that had risen in applause could fall again into fatigue. The choice remained clear but demanding. As Traoré once phrased it, the summit is only safe when one keeps climbing. And so the question is not which future awaits, but who among us will keep climbing with him. By now, the viewer is no longer just observing. They are implicated. Because after hearing this story unfold, neutrality becomes impossible. What Ibrahim Traoré began on that podium has already reached every screen, every cafe, every restless conversation about Africa's future. For those who care and stay informed, the thinkers, the readers, the relentless questioners, understanding this moment is power. Their role is to keep the debate alive, to follow data not slogans, and to challenge anyone who treats pride as propaganda. For those affected indirectly, traders, teachers, migrants, small business owners, awareness is preparation. Every fluctuation in the Sahel now carries both risk and opportunity. Knowing the rhythm of change means surviving it. And for the indifferent, the silent, the ones who scroll past these words, silence too is a vote. Because when dignity is discussed and you look away, you have chosen your side. Whichever group you belong to, the outcome converges here. Understanding Ibrahim Traoré's message is no longer a matter of curiosity, it's a matter of relevance. To listen is to stay awake. Solutions were never meant to sound poetic. And Ibrahim Traoré himself warned, if action does not follow words, speeches become ornaments. So the question turned practical. What must actually be done? By whom and when? At the leadership level, governments in the Sahel must strengthen civic education and regional coordination. That means measurable outcomes. Restore trade corridors within 6 months, cross-border training programs for youth within a year, and transparent reporting on defense cooperation. Success will not be applause, it will be accountability. At the institutional and corporate level, businesses and media houses carry their own duty. They can invest in local production chains, fund public journalism, and commit to fair hiring across borders. The metric here is stability. Fewer imports, more participation. At the citizen level, the path is quieter but just as binding. Teaching truth at home, refusing the easy cynicism, protecting one's craft with discipline. These are acts of reconstruction. When individuals act with rigor, societies accumulate coherence, because in the end, implementation, not inspiration, decides legacy. And if this movement means anything, it must be this. History will not reward slogans, only structure. He returned to the same place where it all began. The stadium now empty, the lights cold. The echo of that night still hovered in the air, half memory, half question. There, Ibrahim Traoré's words no longer sounded like defiance, they sounded like inheritance. You could trace the journey from that single match to this silence, from applause to awareness, from spectacle to substance. Each moment had peeled another layer of the continent's self-doubt. What began as noise had turned into meaning. And now, standing at the edge of the story, the listener understands. This was never about sport, nor even about politics. It was about the fragile thread between pride and responsibility. History will keep replaying that night, not for its score, but for its lesson, that greatness begins when celebration turns into consciousness. And from that point on, every cheer must carry a purpose. 12 words, closing line. When pride wakes, silence is no longer an option. Each listener will leave this story differently. Some will carry its fire, others its doubt. Both are needed. Because a message like this is not meant to end, it's meant to multiply. If you believe more people deserve to understand what Ibrahim Traoré's words truly meant, beyond the headlines, beyond the noise, then share the thought, not the link. Talk about it in classrooms, in cafes, in the quiet of daily life where history usually hides. Every retelling keeps the conversation awake. And if you've listened this far, it already means you care. So let this not be a finish line, but a circle widening, because every story of dignity grows stronger when it's spoken again. Now the question returns to you. What truth will you keep alive after this voice fades? Long after the stadium emptied, one question still lingered. What happens to a continent that begins to listen to itself? The cameras had moved on, but the echo of Ibrahim Traoré's challenge remained in the air, heavier than applause, softer than regret. In small towns across Burkina Faso, people spoke of the speech as if it were a storm they had survived. It had unsettled, but also cleansed, and somewhere between discomfort and clarity, they found the beginning of ownership. Silence, they realized, had been the real colonizer. Every time they waited for permission to feel proud, they lost another piece of themselves. But now, even in disagreement, they spoke. And that alone was evolution. The power of a word is not in how loud it is said, but in how long it refuses to die. Months later, the wave reached farther than expected. University students in Dakar created a symposium titled Traoré's Africa Between Pride and Policy. In Lusaka, a poet rewrote the speech into verse, calling it a Republic of the Awake. And in the diaspora, from Paris to Montreal, African communities replayed that night as if replaying a forgotten chapter of themselves. Governments might manage economies, but culture manages memory. What began as a political moment had become a cultural current, unregulated, unstoppable. The phrase, "when Africa wins, it's never just a match," appeared on street murals, in music lyrics, on classroom walls. Even critics admitted that no recent event had unified so many countries around a single question. What does sovereignty sound like when it speaks in our own voice? The echoes no longer needed permission. They had become the rhythm of a generation. Years from now, history will decide what Ibrahim Traoré truly represented. To some, he will remain the soldier who spoke too boldly. To others, he will be the man who dared to remind the continent of its worth. But the real legacy will not rest on statues or state archives. It will live in how ordinary people change the way they introduce themselves. In how a child in Bamako says, "I am African," without explanation. In how an immigrant in Europe no longer lowers his voice when talking about home. The victory that night was not Mané's alone. It was an exorcism. The ghosts of inferiority, of borrowed pride, of deferred respect were finally named, and once named, they began to fade. Africa's next chapter will not be written by speeches, but by sentences like these, quiet, deliberate, owned. Because once a people reclaims the right to describe itself, the world must learn a new language to address them.